Hi guys, happy Tuesday. Welcome to the morning after. I am your host, Sharleen Joynt, and of course today we're recapping episode 6 of season 23, otherwise known as Colton's season of The Bachelor. And you know by now that we start every recap off with a moment that delivered, and this is brought to you by Skip the Dishes. And this is a lighthearted moment that stood out to me, and of course you know, especially if you're Canadian, that Skip the Dishes delivers food, delicious food to your house. And so you can eat in your pajamas, which I am a fan of. So this week's moment that delivered is actually Sydney when she left, and she looked Colton square in the eye and said, "Figure out what you came here to find." Now, I wasn't wild about the fact that Sydney sort of suggested that there were still women there that were not ready. Of course, she would be one of only a couple of several women to do that. But what I loved about her saying, "Figure out what you came here to find," is the timing just felt really right. We had just gotten off his one-on-one with Hannah G, where pretty much the entire date was spent with them making out, or at least that's what was shown. And given we just saw that with Cassie last week, it's starting to feel a little like, you know, for someone who seems to be as ready as he is, it's just, I feel like we're not getting much substance in any of the front runner relationships. And so for her to just sort of be like, "Figure out what you came here to find," I just feel like he needed to hear that. And it just, in light of the last two big one-on-one dates this week and last week, it just sort of like fell with a thud. It just felt like a really important thing to have said. It felt like it's starting to feel like he doesn't really know what he wants that much, and so kind of felt like he just needed to hear that when he heard it. So yes, that was this week's moment that delivered. So moving on, we start the episode off with last week's rose ceremony. This is no surprise. It was so obvious that Colton was going to send home Nicole and Onyeka. I kind of feel like they asked for it. I don't think anyone's denying that. I think they would admit that. What I liked here is that they both left so graciously. You know, they didn't give him a hard time. They didn't try to change his mind. I was kind of worried. Oh, thank you, Nadia. Hoodies are in. And they didn't try to change his mind or anything. They just sort of were like, "Thank you for everything. Like, wish you all the best. Like, you've got great girls here." And I just think that that's exactly what they should have done in that under those circumstances. And I'm so glad. I was kind of nervous that they were going to like make it awkward, but they didn't. So we move to Vietnam, where Hannah G gets her hotly anticipated one-on-one. Now, it was kind of interesting here is that back at the hotel, we get a girl chat between Cassie and Kaylin, where Kaylin kind of is sort of throwing Hannah G under the bus a bit by sort of like insinuating that Hannah G lacks depth, saying that she has relied on her looks, which is a little ironic because, I mean, all of these women in some way have relied on their looks. They're all stunning. And B, it's just such a shame that Kaylin had to do this because it wasn't a great look on her, and she doesn't need to do that to be a front runner. And also, what bothered me is that it never really felt like Hannah G got redemption from that on this date, because she was sort of treated like a piece of meat on this date. And even if they had great conversation, I didn't feel like it was shown. So it just sort of felt like she wasn't able to defend herself via the edit of her date. And that really bugged me. I mean, once again, the entire daytime portion of this date, there's zero conversation, to the point where when they recap their favorite part of the day, they both say the shower. There was like nothing. I felt like it was not productive at all. We already knew they had chemistry. Like, we want more if we're supposed to consider, you know, this a serious relationship. In the evening, Hannah G opens up about her parents' divorce, and they bond over this. And I could see it being something, you know, to bond on for sure. But of course I realize that Hannah G is prompted, you know, you're supposed to open up about a topic, and the producers say, "What do you want to talk to Colton about tonight?" And I understand that happens. But overall, this felt like very like, now we'll talk about this. Like, it just didn't feel like a conversation that came up naturally, and it just didn't feel like a natural flow in conversation. It just, the whole date overall just felt more superficial than I'd like, considering she's a front runner. And I just sort of feel this way about all the front runner relationships. So not all of them, but with Cassie as well. I'm sure there's more that we're not seeing, but how come we're not seeing it? It's really annoying. Okay, group date. So during the day, the ladies are taken to do some sort of a fighting form called Vovinam, which was pretty cool looking, but it also just felt like an excuse to have the women sort of punch each other in front of each other. It sort of felt like they were learning all these formal moves, but then when it came down to it, they were just sort of like attacking each other. And then in the evening, this evening kind of felt like a slog. There were a lot of conversations shown, but once again, it just didn't feel that productive. The one that stood out the most to me was Katie. And I felt bad for her because Katie pretty much said, she's like, my greatest fear in all this is being misunderstood. Now, I can relate to this big time. Like, whenever I interact with people, the worst feeling is feeling misunderstood. Like, you said something, it was, you know, and it rubbed people the wrong way, or that's not how you meant it. And so I can relate to her also not showing the highs and lows emotionally. And she even talked about seeming monotone. Like, I can totally relate to that as well. But so that's why the fact that he ended up sending her home after this with no explanation, this was pretty much the last conversation they had. It just really didn't seem right in her overall arc, considering Katie started really strong. She had a ton of airtime early in the season. She had one of the very few kisses on night one. It just sort of felt like, what happened here? Why didn't we get more pieces to this puzzle? And especially since the end of this conversation was a hug. This really stood out to me, because usually it's like, oh, I'm feeling this and this, I'm feeling XYZ, I want you to know I'm in it, and then it's like, make out. That's routine now. But with her, it was a hug, and it just felt right, and it felt more intimate in a way, because, you know, the times that I am upset and I'm getting comforted by my husband, it's not like that turns into a makeout session. It's a hug moment. And so it just sort of felt like Colton was on the same page as her, and then it ended with a hug, and then he sent her home, and it just didn't feel right or fair, and like, it just felt like we were missing something. Obviously, the other big thing to happen in this group date is Sydney confronts Colton, and she pretty much is like, what's going on? Do you see anything with me? Can you see anything with me? And I talk about this in my Flare recap, so I will save my breath, but he does get a bit defensive here and says, everyone expects me to have everything figured out. I don't. All he has to do here is be honest. If you don't see it with her, just let her go. It's so simple. She's asking him point blank, and it really bugged me that he couldn't just do that and make her decision easier for her. But read my Flare recap. Okay, so moving on to Kirpa's one-on-one. I mean, this was a lovely date. Kirpa is adorable. If you watched her deleted scene, I link it out in the Flare recap, about her chin injury. I mean, she's so sweet. But once again, it's like we haven't seen her all season. How are we supposed to be invested? Like, they keep talking about hometowns being around the corner. So then when someone who we haven't seen any of gets a one-on-one date, it's sort of like, it just feels a little tedious. Like, how are we supposed to be that invested in this? Are we supposed to really think that she's in the running? I know it's possible. It has happened. It's just very unlikely. It's very unlikely. That said, I do really like Kirpa. I think she's so normal, and it's refreshing. I like it. Okay, Demi visits Colton's suite and tells him she's falling for him, and he promptly sends her home. I understand why he'd do this, because it, you know, very much like, oh, you think you're falling for me, I don't see it with you. But it was so the opposite of what he had just done with Sydney, which was like, can you see it with me? And he's like, oh, maybe. And it's like, I just sort of feel like he's a bit all over the place. Like, he doesn't really, he's not treating everyone, you know, with the same set of rules, if that makes any sense. It also felt like he pretty much admitted at the end of this episode that he sent Demi home because he thought that's who Sydney was talking about when she said that there were girls who were not ready. And so it just sort of feels like he's kind of flailing, and he's putting way too much stock in what all the women are saying about each other, and it just didn't feel like that decision he made right then and there was 100% his own. I would love to be wrong about this. I hope I'm wrong about this, but it just sort of felt like he was skewed. He's processing too much of what the women are saying, and it's starting to affect how he treats them and how he sends them home. Finally, we have the rose ceremony where, of course, he sends Katie home, and she too warns him about the women in the house. And he has a full-blown meltdown, which is becoming par for the course. Every time a woman says something to him, he, in the face of conflict, does not keep it together very well. And yeah, it seems like next week things are gonna come to a head. That's it for episode 6. It was kind of a mess, honestly. It's sort of weird watching the lead sort of unravel like this, especially kind of prematurely. Like, we're used to seeing that in, the final or pre-final episode, hometown week, I get it. You're becoming super invested. It's only episode 6. It's a little early to be this freaked out. Anyway, thank you for tuning in to the morning after, and be sure to read my Flare recap, and of course my Pretty Pandas recap, all the recaps, and I will see you guys here next week for episode 7.